Greetings, everyone, and welcome to session 7 of our festival for the protection of all beings, an inquiry into advancing technologies and their consequences and possibilities. I'm your host, Peter Maravelis, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and our co-sponsors at the Goethe Institute San Francisco, the MIT Press, and the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney, we'd like to welcome you to the second day of this amazing symposium. It involves lectures, panel discussions, workshops, and film screenings, bringing together activists, artists, scientists, and theorists to explore advancing technologies and their effect upon culture and the environment. As is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. This session is titled We, the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age. We're going to be featuring Wendy H. Wong. This is going to be a deep dive into data rights for the digital age and offer a kind of a call to action, really thinking about the right to data literacy. In our data-intensive world, our humanity often suffers at the hands of moneyed interests. We experience a loss in terms of autonomy, community, dignity, and equality. Professor Wong has crafted a compelling case for us to engage as stakeholders in holding data collectors accountable for how they use our analytics. Just as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights laid the global groundwork for human rights, Dr. Wong gives us a foundation upon which we can claim human rights in regards to our data in the digital age. Wendy H. Wong is Professor of Political Science and Principals Research Chair at the University of British Columbia in Okanagan. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Internal Affairs, How the Structure of NGOs Transforms Human Rights, with Sarah H. Stroup, and The Authority Trap, Strategic Choices for International NGOs. Her current book, We, the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age, is published by the MIT Press and is the source material from which this talk is based upon. Please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Wendy H. Wong. Welcome to City Lights.
And thank you for that introduction. I'm also going to need to screen share. Okay, great. I think we are all set. So thank you so much, Peter, for that lovely introduction and the kind invitation to speak at this event. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy weekend to come to this talk. So I'm a political scientist, which means that I'm often thinking about power in society and how power is distributed. And today, like Peter said, I will be talking about a book that is coming out with MIT Press next week, in fact, on Tuesday. And it's a book that draws heavily on other fields outside of political science. So I look at the social sciences generally, but also I draw on law, some tech writing, and certainly some humanities fields. And the point of the book is designed to think through what is missing in our conversations about technology if there is no political science or social science analysis. And I think one of the ways that we can do this, and the way that I do this through the book, is through the lens of human rights. So to give you a bit of context, We the Data came about right before the pandemic hit. And, as we all know, our lives shifted in short order from in-person to online because of the pandemic. And it offered actually a great time for me to reflect on how pervasive digital technologies are, how much our lives have changed because of those technologies, and then also how much of our lives have become data. So in the short time we have together today, I'm just going to be talking about some of the concepts I introduced in the book, and I'll provide a rationale for why we need a human right to data literacy. And I'll end with some thoughts about the consequences of data and the datafication of societies, and why human rights is a good starting point for thinking about those issues. So I like to start off by asking a bit of a trivia question. I don't expect anyone to answer given this format, but what do Amazon.com, basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal, and the reality TV show Shark Tank have in common? Well, I answer this question in the opening pages of the book. They are all tied together through the Ring doorbell. Amazon owns the Ring company, which was initially featured on Shark Tank. And while its fortunes had not been doing so well, that appearance and, among other things, Shaq's endorsement of the Ring actually led to the rise of this product and the success of the brand today. So I'm sure many of you, of course, have encountered the Ring or any number of other video doorbells like the Google Nest or the Arlo or the Blink, which, by the way, is also owned by Amazon. You may even own one. In fact, about 1/5 of American households do. And sales surged during the pandemic, also in Canada as well, and in other places. So the Ring, along with other doorbells, offers purchasers the ability to monitor and record the area around their doors, or really wherever they decide to place these doorbells. And they make audio and visual recordings. Owners can speak to visitors and answer the door even when they're not home. You can also use Ring to link to a bunch of other Ring products, like cameras and lights, making your own little security system for your property through the internet. Now, what does this have to do with human rights? So smart doorbells like the Ring are what we might think of as everyday objects. And increasingly, everyday objects are raising important questions for the human experience and therefore human rights. As our devices become more and more data intensive and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence come to rely on massive pools of data in order to work, more and more of our everyday mundane activities become data. In other words, data are being taken from us, about us, in the most unexpected and often mundane ways. So the Ring doorbell has audio and visual detection and recording abilities, and these abilities change the terms of who can survey, who can perform surveillance. Where we might be accustomed to and understand the purpose of closed circuit TV monitoring, for example, by private businesses or public spaces, Ring products are placed on homes, facing the street where people walk in public spaces. So this surveillance is being done by homeowners for private purposes. Our images and voices are captured on Ring, creating audio and visual data for analysis. Now, Ring has gotten into actually some controversy for the agreements it has with law enforcement to share Ring camera data without the knowledge or consent of those doorbells owners. Doorbell owners themselves, through paid subscriptions, can actually download video and audio captured by their devices as well. Now, sometimes these devices work in unanticipated ways. There have been a number of documented cases where hackers actually hijack the camera or the two-way microphone on Ring cameras and actually stalk children, the elderly, and other unsuspecting users. In other words, surveying those who wanted the surveillance to begin with. And then I think about all of us as pedestrians and as drivers who are probably unaware of these devices as we move about in our neighborhoods. We are not consenting for those activities, however mundane or harmless, to be captured. Doorbell owners themselves are not always consenting to the use of footage caught on their devices. And I would add, practically speaking, it would be very difficult for all of us to consent to actually what the Ring is designed to do. And as I said, the Ring is just one of countless smart objects recording and sharing data about us with various entities, whether those are corporate or government, that have an interest in the collection of data from people. So this raises a couple of questions for me, and I use these to frame the rest of my remarks. First, to what extent are human activities and human existence itself becoming data? And second, and probably most critically for my work, how are rights as human beings being tested and perhaps violated in a social context in which data-intensive devices are ubiquitous? They're in our pockets, on our wrists, on our desks, and in our homes. So I've structured this talk in terms of 5 takeaways that I'd like everyone to have. So these days, we hear a lot about data from people or about people, and we're often confronted with news about how companies are using data in ways we find troubling, such as tracking our behavior across the internet, or some of us becoming free fodder for generative AI tools like ChatGPT. Perhaps we feel that we can't help but fall victim to these incidents because of how our daily lives are structured and organized. I'm sure many of you today who are here have smartphones, and we're all gathered on a digital platform called Zoom. And we depend on the internet to conduct many of our day-to-day activities. We engage, in other words, with digital technologies, whether we like it or not. We tap into public transit, We patronize stores that use loyalty programs or even sometimes facial recognition technology. And we walk through the streets around our homes where the homes have digital doorbells like the Ring on them. One way to think about this is that our lives are datafied. That is, behaviors that are revealing of our innermost thoughts and personal activities have become digital data. Another way to say this might just be that a big part of our lives have become data. So what does this all mean for human life? So in this process, I think that many of us, many of the people I talk to about this work feel like they're data subjects, which is that data are being taken from us, but we have very little to say about the matter. We have very little to say about the terms on which this happens. And we feel that we might have very little choice but to be subjected to such data collection because of the way our lives are lived through online interaction. So this book is about why it's important to become a data stakeholder and how human rights can get us there. We need to understand what it means to be a data source, how important this role is, and why, even in a sea of data sources like us, we don't have to lose to powerful data collectors, companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta. To be a stakeholder, we make our voices heard. And this is currently quite difficult because there's so many data sources. In fact, billions and billions of us. But that's, I think, in part because we're not thinking about data as something intrinsically human. Instead, the way we're often told to think about data is as a commodity, something to be bought and traded and sold, like oil. Data are frequently referred to as dust or detritus or exhaust. We're told we're the product if we're not paying. Now imagine a world where we thought of data not as part of the market, but as part of us, as part of a human being, and as part and parcel with human life. What if data were subjected to the globally endorsed framework of human rights? What this would mean is that we could be more effectively data stakeholders. Stakeholdership means we have skin in the game and we have an entitlement to speak up. And rather than sitting back and being subject to data collectors' policies on how they make, store, and analyze data about us, we need to start directing the conversation to make our future in data one embedded in human rights. Now, before I turn to human rights themselves, I do want to talk about some characteristics of data and what makes them special. So in the book, I call data sticky, and I think of them as sticky like gum on the bottom of your shoe. It's really easy to step on gum and really hard to take it off. I think about data in the same way. It's really easy to generate data from your activities, but not so easy to be rid of them or really even know that they've been created for the 4 reasons on this image. Now, before I talk about those characteristics, we all know that data are easily copied and transferred. And for the economists in this room, that means non-rival and only partially excludable. The easy copy and easy transfer of data are the qualities that make data useful. But when I say data are sticky, I mean more than that. So when we talk about data from people, there are 4 other ways that data can be stuck on us. And the first is that data are about very mundane events in the sense that they're not remarkable, and we may not even think of them as very interesting, which is what makes them all the more invasive. It's about our choices, our everyday choices, what's in our Amazon cart, how long our jogs are, for example, but also all the little things our devices are tracking about us, all our locations, our little behavioral quirks, how quickly we walk, what's the barometric pressure in a place that we are right now. In other words, data are mundane. They're not remarkable. And the fact that these data are collected demonstrates not just that everyday activities have value when collected across a population, but that we are increasingly having our mundane activities recorded for someone to analyze, categorize, and generate predictions from. These are things we might have called private or simply boring. They're also things we can't avoid. We simply cannot avoid many of these behaviors that are being tracked. The second reason data are sticky is because they're linked. And this is just referring to the fact that data are often bought and sold. And so any data collected by a data collector doesn't just stay neatly in a data set. They're shared across multiple data sets. And sometimes this is a very helpful thing to do, especially for medical research, to have different kinds of data gathered across large populations to be merged together to understand better the spread of disease, for example. But we have to weigh those kinds of benefits against concerns around data safety and the implications of collecting and pooling all kinds of very sensitive information about individuals. And we know this information can be used to, for example, deny insurance altogether, or raise insurance rates, or even discriminate against certain medical conditions. And so data are linked. The third reason data are sticky is that they're effectively forever. Because once data are created about our lives, it's very hard to know what happens to those data. We don't know where they go. We don't know if they're deleted. We simply must assume that they are effectively immortal. The last reason data are sticky is because they're co-created. And I talked about data sources and data collectors earlier. And this is the idea that no data about people exists without the presence of a data source, and that's most of us, and a data collector, which is typically a company that is interested in some aspect about human life such that they are collecting data about it. In other words, without you and your activities, there'd be no data. But without the company, there would also be no data, because data do not exist in nature. They have to be created. So the characteristic of co-creation really poses a practical problem if we want to think in human rights terms about whose data they are. Are they yours because you're the source of the data? Or are they the companies because they are the collectors and therefore creators of that data? We also need to think about the collective nature of data, whether we think about it explicitly. So think about the types of photos that often get posted on social media, such as group photos, where you are one of many people and you may not be the person posting that photo, for example. Or how, in fact, data are used by artificial intelligence technologies to create categories of, quote, people like you. Thus, the data that come from each and every one of us as individuals are used to make new groups from which to draw inferences and make predictions. So therefore, we actually have the possibility of affecting someone else's life in a very direct way without even knowing how. And that is another sense of how data are co-created. They're not being created in isolation. They have collective and individual implications. So the stickiness of data means that we are all stuck in a system where we often can't help but generate data. And in turn, these pools of data exert effects on our everyday lives. So let's turn to human rights to think about how they can help us through this situation. As the political scientist Jack Donnelly argues, human rights are not about what humans are, but what we might become. They are about potential. Many of you in the crowd might be familiar with the story of how human rights came to fruition internationally after World War II. So I'll quickly go through that story here so we're all familiar on the same page. So initial efforts after the end of World War II culminated in the creation and acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or what's commonly called the UDHR, in 1948. Through years of negotiation, these state delegates came up with 30 articles they saw as key to the establishment of international human rights, which are universal, unconditional, and interdependent. They are entitlements we all have, which means states are responsible for ensuring that we can exercise our rights. And some of these examples of human rights are probably very familiar to all of you. Freedom of expression, freedom from torture, but also things like the right to education, the right to choose a marriage partner, and the right to a fair trial are all among the many human rights we hold today. Now, since the UDHR, there have been 9 main human rights treaties signed through the United Nations. And in political science, we often refer to these treaties singularly in our work, but all of these treaties are important for articulating specific protections for all human beings. So in a situation where our lives are datafied, I'm arguing that we need to step back a little bit from the specifics of all these different conventions and the existing international law to think more about the motivation for human rights and why they're important for datafication. In other words, we want to think about why all these human rights even exist to begin with and how they all fit together. This was actually not obvious in 1948, even within a general framework like the UDHR. And one of the co-authors of that document, the famed French diplomat and French diplomat and lawyer René Cassin, came up with a framework which he likened to the portico of a Greek temple, which you can see now on this image. There's steps leading up to a beautiful entryway where there are pillars holding up the roof of human rights. And the rights are organized within or organized by an internal logic that goes from individual to collective, really holding up a house of human rights. But I want to point us to, of course, if anyone in this talk has ever built anything, the foundation is extremely important. And in fact, I think the foundation of human rights is what we need to focus on in a world of datafication. And the four values that form the foundation of human rights are, as shown here, dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Now, these are very big values, and they have lots of different meanings. And I argue that these meanings have shifted because of the way that our lives have moved through technological development. So we might be tempted to do the impossible, to boil down these important words into simple definitions. But I do want to sort of start us off by thinking about what the general meaning of these words are. So when we think about liberty, or what I call autonomy in the book, this means acting unencumbered in the world, to be making your own free choices. The idea of community, which is how I've updated the word brotherhood, is to think about the ideas of sociality and membership, how we are not alone as individuals in the world. Dignity is, of course, about the worth of a person, both in terms of how they feel and then the way they are treated. And finally, equality speaks to a desire to be treated without discrimination and in accordance with a certain baseline. So it's not that data stickiness or datafication has changed the importance of dignity and equality, autonomy and community. I would argue that, in fact, that's very much not the case. But where the framers of the UDHR are worried about physical detention and physical constraints on a human's ability to flourish, we now also have to think about how flourishing is limited by digital limitations. We have to recognize what the framers could not, that human life is physical and digital. So what I argue in the book is that stickiness of data can change. Sometimes it actually hurts our abilities to exercise autonomy and dignity. And how data sticks to us is a question for not only equality, but the equity of the human experience. And we all are becoming more familiar with how ideas of community have become impaired as we encounter technologies like social media that make it a challenge for us to create social coherence. All right. The fourth takeaway is about big tech. Now, we're used to thinking about multinational firms that drive the digital economy, or what we call big tech, as powerful because they are wealthy. They are incredibly, historically wealthy. But money is just one way to exercise power. And in fact, the nature of big tech's creations and their role in collecting data have actually given them more than just economic power. They also govern in ways that we're used to thinking about states doing. Governing means creating order around shared expectations. It means setting rules and finding ways to enforce those rules. So governing is often what we expect governments to do. Yet more and more, big tech can be said to govern. They create and control the digital platforms through which we have access to services and create social and political connections. They affect how we enjoy human rights. For example, Meta controls the community standards on its platforms Instagram and Facebook. These standards set the basis for the kinds of speech that can happen on those platforms. Now, between its different platforms, which also includes WhatsApp and Messenger, Meta reaches more than 3 billion people. It actually reaches close to 4 billion people, and that's a number that's increased since I've written the book. And that's far more people than any government can legitimately claim to govern. Meta has an oversight board. This is a body that uses human rights to evaluate what gets removed or reinstated on Facebook and Instagram. And the decisions that the oversight board makes affect people the world over, and that is not an exaggeration, given the numbers that people that use Meta's products. Now, right now, human rights responsibility falls on states. Big tech falls under the category of business, which has to respect human rights. But what if they don't? As of right now, Google and Facebook are actually declaring they'll be blocking Canadian access to news by the end of this year because of an ongoing dispute over compensating journalism outlets. In other words, they are threatening to deny millions of people access to news and updated information, which affects our abilities to exercise freedom of expression and conscience at minimum, but also other rights such as the right to education. If we are to use human rights effectively in the age of data, we must start thinking about how big tech governs our daily lives, including what we can share, but also what we know. Not holding big tech accountable as governors means we aren't holding them responsible for the changes they have brought to human life. My final point has to do with data literacy as a human right, and I see this as a way for us to become data stakeholders. Now, data literacy, I also argue, should be part of how we think about the universal right to education. Because human life will continue to be data-centric, learning about data, how to make data, how to use data, and the implications of creating digital data about human life will become core to human experience. So without a human right or a universal entitlement to data literacy, we are at risk of leaving most of us behind, while the few data collectors make leaps and bounds by exploiting the data about us. Literacy is about giving individuals skills in order to function in a data-driven society. So data literacy is not about everyone becoming a data scientist. That would be data expertise. Data literacy is about understanding the importance of data and how data can be used in good and bad ways. And it is about understanding how many choices go into the formation of any data. Already there are community-based programs that show us we don't have to be data scientists in order to understand the basic premises behind data creation and how our choices of data sources really matter for what we can learn and what we can predict. Going forward then, we need to think about primary and secondary school curricula. And there's some countries like Estonia that have led the way to developing extensive educational programming in data literacy. But this, of course, takes time. And not only that, countries have different ways of distributing the responsibility for education. So some countries, like Canada and the United States, have very decentralized school curricula design law. Other countries like Estonia also have perhaps more of an impetus to arm their citizens with data and digital literacy skills. Estonia's government services are 99% online, and they also have had to combat misinformation from Russian sources for years. In the meantime, we should also reprioritize the library as stewards of data and data literacy. Libraries are foundational to give people linguistic literacy skills. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be looking towards and funding libraries to give us the wide societal reach we need to bring about data literacy. They, after all, are the original data organizers and data search engines for helping people learn. Outside of data literacy, we should also be thinking about how data scientists, computer scientists, and other engineers are trained in terms of thinking about the products they develop and how they affect the society around them. So to conclude, I have a few thoughts, and this slide shows the types of issues that are covered in the book. I'm happy to dig into any of these topics during the question period. I don't think that human rights are a silver bullet for the challenges of datafication, but I think that centering the values of autonomy, community, dignity, and equality get us started down an established path for what we think is important about human potential. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The scales of power in terms of where data goes and how much data gets taken from our activities is currently balanced toward data collectors. We, as the sources of data, don't have much recourse at the moment because our individual capacities are so small compared to the pooled data and AI-powered analysis of collectors. So we have to also come to terms with the collective nature of data and how individual choices for, quote, our data actually has implications for many others who may not agree with what we choose. We may not ever even be able to claim rights to data about us because of the co-creation of data. And sometimes data are inherently shared. When I say that, I think about DNA and the millions who have used services like 23andMe. And in turn, there are millions of relatives who may or may not know about the use of 23andMe, but nonetheless, whose data are now implicated in the DNA data that's been created. Following from the idea of data literacy, I think we also have to consider the true significance of companies like Meta explicitly making human rights affecting decisions about what happens on their platforms. So as I mentioned, the oversight board explicitly is about regulating what happens on Facebook and Instagram, and its goal is to protect the freedom of expression. But if you look at the cases that have come before this board, it's not just about expression. It's about a lot of different kinds of rights. And that's because human rights are interdependent. They're not piecemeal. And so by happenstance, big tech has actually become global governor of human rights through their technologies. They don't have the same official roles or the same responsibility when it comes to protecting human rights as states do. And this is actually a big area of concern. Finally, because data are practically forever, insofar as we can never verify that they aren't, we also have to think about the human implications for having data floating around about us, about our very most mundane behaviors. There are technologies out there that exist already for recreating people based on data about them. And there'll be many more contenders, I think, in this vein before long. So I appreciate you all for listening. And I'll end my remarks there.
Thank you so much for that, Wendy. As we are waiting for questions to come in, they're coming in. Good. Kuhan says, has there been any discussion around nationalizing Meta, similar to Amtrak or public banking? That way, it could be accountable to constitutional law and due process and other human rights initiatives. Perhaps Mark Zuckerberg could do community service in the meantime at the US Postal Service or shelving books at the library.
I have seen some talk about nationalizing social media in general. I have not seen any specific company takeovers by government agencies, but that is, I mean, it's an intriguing idea. And the logic behind, taking something like social media away from private corporations is, of course, it's become such an integral part of protecting individuals' freedom of expression and ability to exercise freedom of speech. And so, there's a logic behind making then the way that we use social media mediated through governments, which are responsible for protecting human rights. So I think that's my response. I think that I don't know where that conversation has gone. I haven't followed it, but there are definitely people who are proponents of that.
Let's see. As we're waiting for more to come in, I wanted to see if you could comment more on the interdependency of human rights that you mentioned before. The Writers Guild of America just experienced a historic victory regarding AI. And I'm thinking a lot about in this moment, there seem to be these opportunities, especially in terms of labor, to be able to make headways. The rest of us could also benefit from this as well in terms of advocacy. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great link. That specific strike was about the skill of writers, right? So their ability to do better than the average person of expressing or exercising their freedom of expression. But as you say, it brings in not only that sort of skill, but also the right to associate with others, right? The right to freely associate, to form labor unions, to protest, and the right to have fair wages for one's labor. And I think that is such a huge topic in terms of thinking about AI in particular. Not only are we talking about data that are being taken from so many of us doing our everyday things as data sources. A lot of the data these days is not being sorted and categorized and predicted on entirely by machine. And I think with things like ChatGPT, people probably assume that all AI is going through massive amounts of data, creating, categories on its own, and then spitting out this magical output. Actually, a lot of AI requires labor. It requires human tagging to work, right? So there's been a lot of talk about this, which is, I think, really important, about the use of people in the developing world as gig workers to tag millions of photos, images, or other types of data. And there's lots of the photo tagging. So they take an image of a street, and workers have to tag, this is a bus, this is a pedestrian, this is a crosswalk. You can imagine how many things are happening in any given picture of a street scene. Or a company like Roomba actually uses, some models of their vacuums also have image taking technology, and they're actually workers, and they're tagging photos of chairs, people's legs, cats, anything you can imagine happening in a house where an automated vacuum is vacuuming to help improve the product, right? But of course, we have to ask about privacy in those situations. And so it's very, very easily, I think, when we think about AI, when we think about the massive quantities of data being generated about human life, it's very clear it's not just about privacy. It's not just about expression. It's about all the rights that we've come to enjoy in our lives since 1948, because human life, of course, human rights are trying to capture all the different swaths of human life and possibility. And so it makes sense why we need to think about the role of human rights in age of data more broadly than just singular rights, because they were not designed to be, sort of hermetically sealed. They were designed to flow into each other, because, there are a lot of human activities that depend on the protection of multiple types of rights in any given moment.
Yeah. If you were to advise activists who are trying to focus their energy right now on new legislation, where would you direct them? Where do you think the most progress can be made in this kind of a moment?
There's a lot going on now, right? And I think it's a really important time, because governments outside of the European Union are coming to terms with the sort of wide spectrum of what it really actually means to have a technology like AI, or the technologies we associate with AI, coming to fruition and unleashing themselves on society. So, here in Canada, where I live, there's a bunch of legislation happening with regard to AI. And in the US, of course, the Senate is talking to AI companies to think about how to shape AI policy. If you talk to AI companies, they're not going to emphasize what matters. And I think, at least what matters to the rest of us, to the data sources. And so, the thing that I've really come to land on with regard to this type of question is that we need to focus on data. So there are three things that you need to make an AI system work. You need high levels of compute power and computing resources, which we have now developed. But it's not a resolved question. We need, sophisticated algorithmic development. And the third thing we need, that is the most human-centric of all, is the data. The data about human behaviors is what drives AI forward. You need the computing power, of course, you need the algorithms, but if you didn't have data, you wouldn't have the AI systems like ChatGPT that we have today. Because what would ChatGPT spit out if not for the data that we've all generated on the internet that it has absorbed and now has made predictions on? So I think that's really where activism should focus on, I think, is on the data, not just on algorithms, not just on making algorithms transparent or accountable, because many of the most sophisticated AI algorithms are not transparent and they are designed to be black boxes. We need to focus on data. We need to focus on the terms of data collection, whether or not we should even allow the kinds of data we allow to be collected now. And we should be thinking about the humanity behind the data and what it means to treat human behaviors as commodities. I think that's a huge philosophical question we have not confronted.
Yeah. Bettina from the Goethe Institute actually has a comment and a question. Let's see if we can find it. Thank you so much. That was very inspiring. Given the evolving landscape of digital technology, how can individuals and communities effectively organize themselves to address the digital age's challenges and actively protect human rights?
Oh, this question, I mean, is so important, but it's very difficult to answer satisfactorily. So I'm sorry, Bettina, because I think part of it, this is why I end the book on a call for data literacy, because I think that many of us cannot fight this fight or even effectively resist what we see is happening unless we come to terms with understanding some of these basic things that have been created through digital data and what digital data are used for and why, I think sometimes people think, well, I'm not doing anything bad, so they can have data about me. Well, that's sort of, I think those types of rejoinders are problematic in the sense that it sort of shows that we need to all be up to speed about how data have fundamentally changed our lives. The fact that they can still collect those data, even if you're not doing something wrong in this moment. Anyone who's lived under an authoritarian system knows that that is just leaving the door open for some future bad thing to happen. So I think, on an individual level, becoming familiar with and comfortable with the idea of data and digital data, I think is the first step. So I think data literacy is a very important part of resistance. I think the other, there is sort of like a bigger problem though, and this is what I talked about with co-creation, is that data are collective and individual in nature. They are very different from how we think about human collective action from before. So as a political scientist, someone who studies a lot on civil society and advocacy, we often, I've studied groups that have come together based on some common interest and have fought for incredible things, right? And really achieved human rights breakthroughs. But one of the issues with the way data are sorted now and the way algorithms create groups of people who are, quote, alike, is that we actually don't know what groups we fall under because these processes are automated or they're based on extremely complicated and, to us, perhaps random combinations of characteristics that make a certain type of person more or less likely to do something, to vote in an election, to buy a certain product, to break the law. So that means that we don't actually know about the collectives that are being created. And that is a fundamentally different type of political non-organization than what we faced in the past. If you think about, the women's movement or the LGBTQ movement, I mean, these are self-organized. And now we're being put into collectives that are not self-organized. And I think that is a bigger question for how, as human beings, we can organize socially and politically.
Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour. We have another session coming up at 1 o'clock, which actually Professor Wong is going to be moderating. So really want to thank you ever so much, Wendy H. Wong, for gracing our virtual halls and for this important call to action and so much to think about. Also, I want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors of this festival, our friends over at the Goethe Institute. Bettina for being such an excellent collaborator and co-producer in all this. Nomi for knowing a good thing when she sees it. Also want to thank David Olson at the MIT Press for his efforts in helping organize the program. Ever grateful to them. Our collaborations over the years with MIT has been really fantastic. Also, our friends over at the University of Sydney, our friends James Jerdurian, who has also been a great influence and a great ally, and to Jose, who is technical and moral support. And last but not least, a huge offering of thanks to Jonathan Keats, who served as also another great inspiration in the planning and the philosophy of this program. As mentioned, our next session is scheduled for 1 p.m. It's called Humans in the Digital Future, and it will feature Cecilia Aragon, Meredith Broussard, Marina Kogan, and Fred Turner. And as mentioned, Professor Wong will be moderating that. Hope you're going to join us. So thank you again. We'll hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone.